Good evening, everyone. My name is Isabelle Charmontier. I'm head of collections at the Linnean Society, and I'm delighted to have so many people attending this evening lecture and delighted to have Pratik with us. And so since so many people have registered to this evening lecture, I just wanted to introduce the Linnean Society briefly before introducing Pratik. So the Linnean Society is a learned society who aims to inform, involve, and inspire people about nature and its significance. And to do that, we have collections, programs, and publications. We were founded in 1788 to house the collections of the Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus, these collections are still in our keeping. And over the years, the Society has acquired the archives of its fellows as well. So we have a rich archive of material describing the natural history of Britain, but also of the British colonial world from the West Indies to India. And I would say from the late 17th century, but mostly through the 18th to the 19th century. And these archives include manuscripts as well as artworks, and they can be searched on our online archives catalogue. And I should say here that we welcome everyone in our beautiful library on Piccadilly. You do not have to be a fellow to research our collections. Like many museums, the Society is committed to the decolonization of its collections. And by decolonization, I don't simply mean the relocation of a statue or an object. For us, it's mostly the long-term process that seeks to recognize the integral role of empire in the building of collections, such as the one we hold, from its creation to the present day, and to recognize the colonial structures that enabled naturalists of the 18th and 19th century to carry out their work. So for instance, we have a meeting tomorrow, in case people don't know. I think it's too late to register, but it will be on our YouTube channel, on natural history and visual arts from the margins, on the many indigenous and local artists who worked for and with British naturalists of the time. So in this context, I am truly honored that the Society is able to host a lecture by Pratik Chakrabarti today, a highly esteemed figure in the field of history of science. So as a way of introduction, Pratik is chair in history of science and medicine and director of the Centre for History of Science, Medicine and Technology at the University of Manchester. Previous to that, he was reader in history at the University of Kent and a research fellow at the Wellcome Unit for the History of Medicine at the University of Oxford before that. Pratik has contributed widely to the history of science, medicine, and global and imperial history, spanning South Asian, Caribbean, and Atlantic history from the 18th to the 20th century. He's also published widely, and I won't enumerate all his published work. You can go and see his page at the University of Manchester. But just to mention, the first book that he published was Western Science in Modern India, Metropolitan Methods, Colonial Practices in 2004. And his most recent monograph was in 2020, Inscriptions of Nature, Geology and the Naturalization of Antiquity. And his recent keynote lectures have been on the themes of decolonization, racism, deep history, the Anthropocene, and the global history of science. So a very warm welcome to the Linnean Society, Pratik. And today your lecture is entitled The Global Heritage of British Natural History. And over to you.
Thank you, Isabel and Padma, for inviting me to this talk. I'm truly honored to be speaking. And Isabel for the wonderful introduction, not to the society particularly. And I think this is an important moment, as Isabel has pointed out, in several British institutions and their links with empire. And my talk is in that spirit, and I'm trying to place in front of you some of the problems, difficulties, questions that I have faced in my own work about how to incorporate the history of empire within the British natural history, science, and the imaginations of nature as such. So it's in that context that this paper or the talk is located. I will start. Let me start with this beautiful painting. This is by James Bailey Fraser from the collection of paintings called The Views of Calcutta and its environs. I think we painted it in 1814. Before going into the painting, whenever I see this painting, I am strangely reminded of Turner's painting of the Grand Canal in Venice. I don't know that that's a false comparison. I'm not an art historian at all, but I am reminded of that for quite a few reasons. It is also water through the city, but what the parallel I find is it is at the same time busy, a scene of activity, but it's also quite serene. It's also quite romantic. So I see that. I think Turner painted that in 1830s, so a few decades after this was painted. So anyway, that is a kind of probably a false comparison, but that always reminds me of that painting. So I just wanted to start with this painting because that is where my talk starts in a certain way. So what you see is the river Hooghly going along the lower parts of Bengal. And the Hooghly is a tributary or a branch of the Ganga, which goes through northern India. And the Hooghly is important because it is, this is the river through which first the Portuguese from the 16th century started navigating up and down and connecting this part, Calcutta, the river, to the Indian Ocean trade. So this Hooghly is quite central in the emergence of European trade in southern Bengal. And this is the river through which that commercial connection between the Indian Ocean and Bengal and through that northern India started. And the East India Company established itself as well on this coast. What you see as well is, so on the right side of the banks of the river Hooghly is the city of Calcutta. And you see this wonderful parts which is known as Garden Ridge, the palatial buildings of the European residents of the city who lived in these beautiful houses here. And this is that Garden Ridge part of Calcutta. Incidentally, it is in this Garden Ridge that Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, once he was removed from his throne in Lucknow in 1856, moved and settled and lived here. And he kind of built a little bit of Awadh here on the Garden Ridge. It's a completely different story, but it's that part of Calcutta. And the river itself, you see the European boats. You also see this local boats of small little boats. You see the wildlife. You see the wonderful coming together of different kinds of wildlife, people in that river. It is that moment. What you see on the left is what is known as the Calcutta Botanical Garden. And so this is the Calcutta Botanical Garden, which was established by the East India Company in 1786 by Robert Kidd. And the primary aim of the establishment of the Calcutta Botanical Garden was to start cultivation of teak, tea, cotton. They even actually experimented with cotton cultivation in the Calcutta Botanical Garden. So it was a very commercial enterprise that started that Calcutta Botanical Garden on the banks, on the other side of Calcutta. And this fascinating building that you see is the residence of the second superintendent of the Calcutta Botanical Garden, who took over after Robert Kidd, that is William Roxburgh. And Roxburgh came here in 1793. The house was built around that time. And this is this magnificent house on the banks of the river, on the edge of the garden that William Roxburgh lived and as a superintendent of the company. So this is the kind of the garden, the commerce, the city, the wildlife that I am trying to start my talk about. Now this river is important to me personally, because this is where my own journey into the study of history of science started. This is where I often crossed over, often in a small boat not in those big boats, but often in a small boat, crossed over and came to the botanical garden and saw the plants, but I was also doing research in the library there. And this is actually the photos of Roxburgh's house that you see on the other painting, the painting before. These are the photos I took myself around 15 years back. So literally these were the photos I took from the river. As the boat was going back to Calcutta, I took the photos from the river itself. So it still looks a fascinating, but a gaunt reminder of the Botanical Garden and this British heritage of the imperial British heritage of natural history on the other side of Calcutta. Talking about the library and the research, the library, the documents used to be housed in this old building here. When I last went, they were no longer here. Most of these documents, particularly the Roxburgh's correspondences with Nathaniel, Wallick, had moved to the main building, the new main building that has now come up. Unfortunately, many of the manuscripts collections still remained at that time. I don't know what's happened with those now, but at that time in the basement of this particular building. Now, I was not allowed to go into the building because I was told that there are snakes actually. And in a way, the snakes, in a strange way, I thought the snakes were guarding the documents. Or in a way, you can say that the nature has claimed history, that the historical documents have become part of the heritage of the nature of the garden. So Roxburgh, who came to the garden in 1793, came from another garden of the East India Company on the Coromandel coast, the east coast of India. So Roxburgh was based in Samulkota near the banks of the Godavari River here, and he came up to Calcutta from here. Now, this site is equally important in this history of the British heritage of natural history, because this is where Roxburgh started his first garden, Samulkota, to cultivate various kinds of spices, cloves, nutmegs in that garden. Excuse me. And this is where the Madras and the Fort St. George establishment of the East India Company was based. And this is, and Roxburgh was a worker of the East India Company. So this is the kind of the East India Company establishment that was there. And it is important also because farther south, this is the region, I don't think you can read them, but this is the region of Tranquebar. And Tranquebar is important because this is where the Danish settlement was in India from the kind of the early part of the 18th century. And the Danish settlement was important in terms of the religious, they were the first pietist missionaries in India. But it was important for natural history collections as well, because the several, and I'll talk about them a little later, but the several missionaries who settled in Tranquebar here started a large collection of plants in these parts. As they started collecting plants, they started reading local Tamil texts and made a large collection of texts. So it was a fascinating collection of both plants in their garden with texts that emerged in these gardens. And they had their own garden in Tranquebar. And there was a fascinating passage when there was a library which had Tamil texts, and the garden next door had several local plants that were grown. So the story the picture that I'm trying to draw is what happens in Calcutta is actually a phenomena that follows what has been happening in other parts of India for almost the entire 18th century. As I said, Roxburgh moved to Calcutta in 1793, towards the end of the 18th century. But throughout the 18th century, you have this interesting collections, settlements along the east coast of India of natural history, people interested in natural history and studying these parts. And this is just a sketch of the Fort St. George, that is the fort of Madras. And what you see, I don't know whether you can see them, in my screen, it's slightly obstructed, but you can see that that's the Fort St. George. This is the Fort St. George, and you have the Black Town and the White Town is here. But what you have is the settlements are interspersed with various kinds of gardens and throughout that region. So what it means is that gardens were a central or a key part of East India Company's settlements, and not only just East India Companies, as I said, the Danish settlement in Vancouver, gardens were a key part of their establishment, even in Pondicherry, where the French were based, which should be somewhere here, that is Pondicherry. So even in Pondicherry, where the French were based, gardens played a key role in their settlements. And the question obviously is why? Why these gardens? What is the role of these gardens that were established? And you may wonder why did I start with this, these images, these maps, these various kinds of settlements in my talk. The simple answer is that this is the global heritage of the British natural history. This is the global heritage of trade, commerce, spices, teak, cotton cultivation, gardens, Hooghly, the coast of Coromandel, and this entire commercial, natural, historical complexes that defined natural history. And the role of the gardens, well, this is a fantastic quote by William Carey, who was a missionary who in Bengal, near Calcutta, in Serampore, who completed Roxburgh's Hortus Bengalensis, says the plants, basically the plants collected in the Calcutta Botanical Garden and in the Serampore Missionary in Bengal. And he starts this passage with this very interesting comment. So the botanical gardens and other noble collections of plants in Europe could never have been brought to the perfection in which they now appear, had not public or private repositories of plants been formed in the different settlements of Asia, Africa, and America. Hence, their importance on all our foreign settlements is clearly established. And he goes on to, if you want, it's entirely freely available, the book online. So he goes on to say a lot about how the various specimens that the European naturalists could see only in very dried form after several months of journey and travel through oceans could be found in these local gardens in various parts of the world in their more natural form, they could be grown in these gardens. So you could see this, that these could be studied in a much interesting and deeper way in that. There's another interesting, so one important part of the garden is this collection of nature, this collection of these repositories of nature that as Kerry has mentioned. The other important phenomena about these gardens, this massive expansion of European gardens, the several hundreds of gardens that I've just mentioned, is that these colonial gardens in Asia, Africa, and Americas are playing kind of a three-part role. One, they are part of the scientific enterprises of Europe, as Carrie had mentioned, that these are the European gardens and the naturalists are deriving their objects of study from these gardens that are growing them from and studying them from the 18th century. So on the one hand, that is the key part. The other important part that the gardens play is that they are connecting the important link between gardens and plantations that develop as almost similar, almost at the same time. And often the plantation or the economic botany and what is gardens are almost inseparable. And there's so many plants that were developed in India particularly, and in the West Indies, which I will go into later, which were developed in plantation forms, were actually first grown in the garden. So you have this connectivity between the plantations and the gardens that is quite unique in colonial gardens in that respect. The third aspect that is important that I will go into even further is that these gardens are maintained in a completely different cultural and material world from the European gardens. Although the scientific enterprises are connected, there's a distinct cultural, social, material logic of nature and garden that exists. And the gardens are the repositories of not only the plants that reached Europe, but gardens are the repositories of a different encounter with nature that takes place in Asia, Africa, and Americas from the 18th century. So it is important to understand that that different world of nature that emerges. So this leads us to consider 2 points here. One is what do we understand by the global heritage of the British natural history. The second is to understand what is meant by natural history. When natural history is practiced in such complex, diverse parts of the world with diverse rationale and logic, what is meant by natural history? We often take that term for granted. And I think there's an opportunity, as Isabel has said, that there is an interest in understanding the imperial rationale behind the collections, not just of the Linnean Society, but various other museums and libraries. There's an opportunity to understand or unravel the category of natural history, and that is what I will do. So for the first question, the answer is quite simple, that this is what is the British, the global heritage? This is the global heritage. It is a heritage that is of commerce, of missionaries, of plantations, of economic botany, and of an alternative engagement with nature that unfolds in these parts of the world. Now, as far as the other question of natural history is concerned, the situation is slightly more complex. And I'll spend some time in exploring this problem of natural history as we face ourselves, as we are faced with when we encounter these kind of contexts. So there are fascinating histories of how European naturalists collected exotic plants and other curiosities from remote parts of the world, named them, sketched them, put them in the books, inside pages, in dried forms, placed them inside their field diaries, and shipped them across the oceans to Europe. Scholars have also juxtaposed various texts of early modern natural history, determining the intricate classificatory differences in one from the other. Yet the world of naturalia that emerged from the 17th to the 18th century had a relatively coherent vision based on experimental, observational, and empirical methods that appeared in Europe from the 17th century. The study of natural history underwent a shift from philosophical reasoning to investigations or empirical investigations of nature. Let us for a moment consider what indeed is the meaning of this curious term, natural history. It is that particular vision of nature. This term reflects that particular vision of nature that emerged in Europe from the 17th century that suggested that nature has its own history of evolution, reproduction, dispersion, and life cycles. It is therefore predominantly an emergence of a biological category and a biological frame of the past. Despite the plurality of collection and classification that emerged or appeared from the wider world, this biological frame and this distinct vision of the history of nature based on secular observation, objectivity, and empiricism defined European natural history from the 17th century. Yet, as I intend to show, the natural and the historical are closely interlinked, and one cannot be separate from the other. So the vibrant literature on the emergence of global history of nature has rendered some of these European histories of natural history relatively provincial. Historians have established that non-European princes, physicians, traders, and scholars played significant roles in channeling these plants, collecting the herbs and animals through complex geographical, epistemological, and cultural routes, and in making the global heritage of natural history. So there is a widening of the recognition, that there is a widening of participation of a demography that shaped this national global heritage. And I think tomorrow's conference, which I'm fascinated about, will talk about this widening global heritage of nature. Yet there's a problem with this widening vision that I face. This is mostly a lateral vision from Europe to beyond, from Europeans to non-Europeans. The question remains, how do we conceptually reframe the materiality, empiricism of nature that emerged outside Europe? Around the same time, in these rivers, the plants, the plantations, the boats, the forts that I started with. The global history of nature poses specific questions to the materiality of nature and natural history that cannot be mapped within an European frame of natural history. While the distinctiveness of the new world of nature that appeared in Europe from the 17th century was based on experimental, observational, and empirical methods, in Asia, America, and the Caribbean, these objects were often seen through frames which are not themselves always empirical in the conventional sense of the term, yet they were deeply connected with the materiality of the same world. So there is a complex problem that I'm trying to uncover, that there is a deep materiality, but that empirical tradition is much more different. Now, to prove or to illustrate, I don't want to prove anything, I'm sorry, I withdraw that word. To illustrate that abstract point that I've just made, I will explore a particular problem, which is the problem of what is an Ipocacola. Bear with me, I'll go through it quite slowly. So originally a Tupi-Guarani name for the plant of the Rubicae family found in Brazil and widely used in the Caribbean and South America for its emetic purposes. Yet, Ipocacola in the 18th century came to specify several plants whose roots showed emetic properties. The Swedish naturalist Carl Peter Thunberg, who was a professor of botany in the University of Uppsala, on his travel to Asia in 1777. So this was actually a plant that was found in South America and in the Caribbean. Now he travels to Asia in 1777 and found a variety of Ipocacola in Ceylon, which were locally called binuge, the root of which was a very good emetic. He specified that this was not the same species as the South American one, but he realized that the name had moved the Ipocacola with the Portuguese to this same plant. So a plant of a different species were called Ipocacola because they had the same emetic properties. Several such varieties of the Ipocacola were in fact discovered in India and Ceylon, where they were used as emetics. By the end of the 18th century, almost any plant in India that displayed emetic properties was called an Ipocacola. So for scientists in Europe, the question was, what was an Ipocacola? Is it a plant or a drug, or a name given to any plant with similar qualities, or even a medical category, or drugs associated with a particular symptom? So there is the problem of a fluid material culture that exists in the global empire and an observational culture of natural history that is trying to map these complexity and losing these various elements in the process. And that is one of the problems that we face. I'll give another example of this problem that we are faced with, the framing of natural history in the 18th century. And that is about this object called Tabashi. Now, a concentration of this Tabashi is a concentration of the joints of the bamboo, which consists largely or chiefly of pure silica. It was used as a medicine for the cure of bilious, vomiting, bloody flux, piles, and various other diseases. Long known in Europe as an oriental and somewhat mysterious drug called Tabashi, it was commonly used in Arabic medicine. Its scientific study was initiated by the physician and naturalist Patrick Russell, who was based in Aleppo in Syria and then in southern India. While in Aleppo, he found the regular mention of Tabashi in Arabic texts, which indicated that the bamboos actually came from South Asia. When he subsequently was posted in India, Russell arranged for these bamboos, which supposedly produced Tabashi, to be sent to him from different parts of South India. Russell then submitted the specimens to the Royal Society, where the chemist James Massey performed chemical experimentations on them in London. However, Massey's experiments proved inconclusive in identifying the specific drug from the residual substances inside the bamboos, and the drug was, or the Tabashi was soon forgotten in Europe. So while it is forgotten in Europe, it remains an important medicine within Asia. And it is used by in Unani medicine, but it's also used by Europeans settled in Europe. In 1830s, and so there's a circulation of Tabashi that takes place within India, South Asia throughout this period. By the 1830s, the Scottish chemist Thomas Thomson received the Tabashi from Calcutta and decided to have one last attempt to decipher its chemical composition with the new chemical experimental methods that he had developed. He ignited in his laboratory the beautiful looking substance, and it exhaled a peculiar odor. He immersed it in water, and a great deal of air was released, accompanied by a cracking noise. He ground it into a powder and dissolved it in distilled water, which rendered it bluish in color but tasteless. He evaporated the water and the grayish scale remained. He mixed the powdered Tabashi with muriatic acid and it decomposed, before he finally ran out of the material to form any firm idea about its constituents and its effectivity. And thus, having satisfied himself that he has done enough, he discarded Tabashi. It was not just Tabashi that was being battered, bruised, and rejected, but an entire British and European encounter with nature in these parts. Now, we can explain this as lack of knowledge. As a historian of medicine, David Cowan once suggested that the scientific knowledge of natural history led to the cleansing of the pharmacopoeia, a very powerful frame, the cleansing of the pharmacopoeia by the application of reason. And this was the process. Thomson's process was a process of cleansing the pharmacopoeia by the application of reason. Or we can see this essential incommensurability of the global heritage of nature. And if there is one point that I want to make in this talk, is that there's an essential incommensurability of this global heritage of nature and natural history. To explain this incommensurability, let us revisit the coast of Coromandel, which I started off with. And I'll just go back if you allow me. So the coast of Coromandel and this interaction that started off. And what the interaction that I'm referring to is an exchange that develops between the pietist missionaries of Tranquebar and Roxburgh, who was still settled in Samolkota on the east coast of India. See, one of the asides I'm making is that this is not just a vernacular problem. It's not Indian vernacular medicine and Indian vernacular practitioners. It's not just European versus vernaculars. It is Europeans themselves who don't fit within that the paradigm. So the story is about actually Roxburgh, who was incommensurable in my understanding to the European natural historical tradition. And so the story is Roxburgh was very keen. He was doing his studies of natural history. He was very keen that his objects would be recognized within European circles of natural history, the transactions of the Royal Historical Society. And he would send them. And he would get very frustrated because these often would be rejected. His work would often be rejected in the publications, and it wouldn't get recognition. So he wrote this sad letter, which many of us have wanted to write when our articles get rejected. And so he writes this very sad letter to the Reverend Christopher John, who was the pietist missionary settled, actually German missionary settled in the Danish settlement, about the sadness of his work not being recognized in Europe. And John writes this very interesting email. This letter to Roxburgh. Europe does not want you so much as India. Can you make so many discoveries for the benefit of the world in England than you have done and will do here? You will be torn in pieces with all your plants and manuscripts and drawings, and you shall never have my blessings in such a degree as you have and shall have as long as you remain in India. Let me understand this very potent paragraph. So for a naturalist like Roxburgh, in Europe, in the gentlemanly cultures of natural history of the Royal Society, was the true recognition of his work. He was tied to that recognition of the work. But often there was deep rejection because there was not that recognition of actually what he was trying to do. They were only interested in the plants, not his world, his Samul Kota, his garden. So his empiricism, his observation and classification appeared subsidiary to that practiced in Europe at the time. John's words to Roxburgh therefore highlights a tension between the worlds of the missionary Christopher John and Roxburgh. While the missionaries could attain fulfillment in their spiritual, material, and natural pursuits in the spatial cultural site of Asia, the mainstream pursuit of 18th century natural history, which Roxburgh had sought, was firmly attached to Europe and which did not recognize this complex world of the heritage of the natural history that had unfolded in that part. It is therefore not surprising that John's premonition about the materiality of Roxburgh's work being torn in pieces in Europe came true. Roxburgh's botanical collections and his manuscripts are now scattered in different places in the British Library, in the Natural History Museum Library, the Botanical Garden Library in India, some of which, as I've mentioned before. The tapestry of that global heritage of the British natural history lies dispersed in these fragments. The point that I'm trying to make is that the history of nature, this global history of nature, gets lost in natural history, which then raises the question, how do we return that history of nature to the natural history? How do we in turn return nature to history, or the natural to the historical? I'll just spend a few last minutes talking about a very different context and to provide a way of coming back or to linking, because I've talked about a very depressive mode of this fragmentation of this natural history and the incommensurability. So I'll spend a few minutes just to talk about how we can bring, or how we can introduce the historical within the natural, the processes of, if you want to call it decolonization, or if you want to understand the global heritage, a simpler word of the global heritage. So how do we connect these objects of nature with these histories that I have talked to you about? And to make that point, I'll take you for a few minutes. Don't worry, I won't spend too long on this, but I'll take you to for a few minutes on the completely different side part of the world, to the Caribbean, across the Atlantic, and particularly to Jamaica. And this is going to be a very strong, broad overview of what I'm going to talk about. So as you know, Jamaica came into British possession and from the Spanish in the 17th century. And so it was in the 17th century that the British had occupied Jamaica from the Spanish. And gradually with that occupation, the plantation economy, or the plantation, the sugarcane plantation economy started in Jamaica from the late 17th and early 18th century. So when you look at Jamaica towards the end of the 17th century, you see two important access points. And I'll talk about this slide a bit later, but let me just explain the two access points that I'm talking about in Jamaica, the history of nature that I'm talking about. So the two access points are, the one is this transition from the Spanish to the English that is taking place in the end of the 17th century in Jamaica, from a Spanish occupied island to an English occupied island. Now that same transition has a different logic attached to it. The Spanish had occupied Jamaica from a very mercantilist point of view. They had discovered bullion, gold, silver in massive contents in South America, and they had believed that these Caribbean islands were deep resources or repositories of bullion and mines. So the Spanish occupation of Jamaica in this period, just before the English, was a very mercantilist occupation in search of bullion. But with the English, that the shift that I'm talking about from the Spanish to the English, with the English, that there's an eclipse of that mercantilism, and there is a taking over of the plantation economy logic that takes place. So it is not just a move from Spanish to English, it is also a move from mercantilism to plantation economy that takes place. And it coexists for a long time. And that is why I come to the slide. So these are the two key texts that you can read in this period of transition. So these are from between Spanish and the English. Sorry, let me explain the other access point that I've talked about. So the first is the Spanish-English mercantilist plantation. The second access point that I'm talking about is the coexistence of a completely different ethnographic groups, which is the Native Americans in Caribbean. By the time the English came, the local populations had disappeared, but other parts of South America. So the local Native American population existed, and the gradual incoming of Africans who were brought over as slaves. So the other access point is a completely different cultural, social world that was establishing itself, and with that a world of nature that was emerging, that is between Native American cultures and African cultures that is coming together in the Caribbean islands. So these are the two broad access points. Now, the broad story of what I'm coming to is, if you read John Taylor's, was the first one of the first histories of Jamaica that was written in 1687, and this has now been reprinted by, it's a very important book. So he kind of glimpsed Jamaica and it's in its first English settlement period. And of course, Hans Sloane's writing around the same. So I think both came almost around the same time, towards the end of the 18th century in the 1680s, and they saw Jamaica at that period. The point that I'm making is, if you read these texts, you see these two access points, very interesting. You see an obsession about minerals still being there, about bullions still being there. They literally searched the mountains for gold and silver. And that is where a different kind of understanding of the nature was existing, in a mercantilist understanding of nature is existing. And then you see a transition to plantation economy, particularly in Hans Sloane's work, but you also see them being aware of the Native American and African traditions of plants, of treatments, of cure. And Sloane constantly asks his local populations about, or the African populations, about the various kinds of plants that they're encountering. So that is the large, complex world that I wanted to share with. And this is just to let you know that Thomas Strawford was a doctor, physician. Sorry, I'm just talking about a lot of things. I can clarify them in my talk, in my question answer. But Thomas Strawford was a surgeon, physician who was based on the same period, 1680s, and he saw this kind of very strong obsession with material, with mercantilism that existed in this period in Jamaica, and you can see that logic that talks about. And he writes that desirable mountains places such as Jamaica hide in their teeming bellies store of the subjects of the mineral kingdoms, and therefore the waters issuing thence are first to be distinguished. Hence the first settling Spaniards named the river that passed by this town of San Diego, Rio de Cobre, or the Copper River, being it is tainted with the issuings forth of some many copper mines, chiefly discernible in the time of floods and freshes, and the mountains rain washed down the creeks and guts in the otherwise wholesome current. And so you can see what happens then. They are bottling this water, they're using it as a treatment. So there is the point that I'm trying to make is there's other pre-plantation engagement with the natural world that is shaped by both history and the natural world of this period that exists. Obviously, they don't find any bullion. They find something different, that is the opportunity to grow sugarcane on a much larger scale. And this transformation in Jamaica takes place over the 18th century. This large-scale transformation in Jamaica that takes place. And I just wanted to show this map. So this is Port Royal, which was the Spanish base, which was, if you want to understand in very straight, clear ways, it is kind of the mercantilist capital. And this is Kingston that develops almost, that's the English town of the plantation economy. So these are Port Royal, and so these are the two worlds. And you have the slaves, and a complete transformation of the natural world of Jamaica, the kind of the mercantilist world, the wild world was now dismantled, and an ordered plantation economy was started. And the various kinds of slave rebellions, struggles that started, that you see throughout the Jamaica, the resistances that struggle throughout the Jamaica. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is, how do you capture this complex world that I've talked about in natural history? How do you return this history to nature? And I'll just give you two, sorry, I'm going back. So two easy examples. One is the herb, and I promise I'll end here. One is the herb, which is known in Spanish as contra hierba or contra hierba, which basically means counter herb. And the reason I find this herb fascinating is it is called counter herb because it is an antidote to poisoning or snake bites or dog bites. So it's known in the Caribbean among the local populations, but also among the Spanish as an antidote. The reason why this antidote is important, because one of the modes of slave rebellion in the 18th century, or even before the 17th century, the Native American rebellion was through poisoning. And the same people who poisoned also knew the antidotes. So this is the pharmacon, the poison antidote duality. So this herb captures that world of changing nature, of distrust, of rebellion, of cure, of antidote that is captured here. The other plant that I wanted to show you is known as majo or manjo. It's also called manjo or Macquarie bitter. I'm using these names very, very consciously. The reason why I'm using these names is, so this is a plant that was found by Henry Barham, one of the people who writes about the natural history in the 18th century. So it's called majo because an old slave woman, healer, called Majo, did wonderful treatments with this plant for various kinds of swellings and illnesses. And it came to be known as manjo. So the name, this is one of the few plants that carries the name of a slave healer. And it's also called Macquarie bitter because it's, there's a Macquarie Bay in Jamaica in southern parts. Is it Trevelyan or whichever province, parish it is. So it's just south of that parish is the Macquarie Bay. So it was found in various parts of that Macquarie Bay. So it's an interesting plant. What you see is a dried plant, but what you start studying, and if you study these 18th century texts, if you study this history of slave rebellion, of European dependence on slave healers, you see these names, these various traditions making more sense in these parts. So each of these plants or medicinal items that I've referred to here, the Ipocacola, the Tabashi, the contra hierba, or the majo bitter, carry in them these histories and that global heritage. This is one of the ways I would suggest we can think of returning nature to history and understand the true global heritage of British natural history. I wish to clarify that by this, I don't mean just returning these objects to their cultural heritage. That cultural heritage is significant and fundamental. But what I mean by that cultural heritage is that I'm not asking for these to be returned to the cultural traditional practices of healing only. Here I'm stressing the need to trace the historical lineages of these objects of nature, the slavery, the plantations, the Livelian, the pharmacon, the poisoning, the trade, that would help us to uncover the global heritage of natural history. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Pratik. I know you want to sit down now, so we'll give you a couple of minutes to settle down. And Padma, I see that 2 people have raised their hands.
Yeah. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll first address the questions in the Q&A. And if you want to ask your question in person, it's Miranda, I can see. Miranda, I'll let you on after the 3 questions are asked. Is that okay, sir?
Yes, that's fine. I think there's 2 people. I saw 2 people raise their hands.
Well, the other one's lowered it, I think. So it's only Miranda.
Okay, that's fine. I'll just wait for Pratik. Okay.
Yes.
So thank you very much for quite a broad and very stimulating presentation, Pratik. I think we've got quite a few questions, so I'm going to dive in straight away, if that's okay. The first, so I'll deal with the questions first, and there's a couple of people who have raised their hands and who want to ask the questions directly. The first question is by Julie Stagg, and I think it relates to the painting that you showed at the beginning. And she asked, when was the Howrah Bridge built in relation to this painting? Sorry, I don't know how you pronounce it.
Howrah, yes, I can't remember. It was much later. It's
Okay.
a much later bridge. I mean, at that point, the only communication was through the boats. And to go to the botanical garden, the Howrah, so there are now 2 bridges that connect the 2 banks. The old Howrah Bridge was not the best because it goes in a completely different way. So if you had to go to the botanical garden, as I did for research, you would take the boat, even when the Howrah Bridge existed.
Okay, thank you. There's one more question, and then I'll let the 2 people who want to ask their question live. Is there any chance that the Roxburgh paper might be rescued from the library basement?
You know, there have been several attempts. I think I don't want to go into great details about digitizing. So they're in 2 parts, I hope. So one is some have been extracted and are in the new building, which I've seen when I last went. Some are actually, the more manuscript forms are supposedly left in that building, the old library building that I showed. They probably cannot be rescued because they're in quite moist, damp. Just let's pretend they have become nature. But the ones that have been rescued, I think there is already a process of digitizing them to an extent. So there is an attempt, and those are mostly what I saw was the communications between Nathaniel, Wallick, and Roxburgh. So these are mostly Nathaniel Wallick's correspondence that exist in that library.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think Liz Hyde has a question for you live.
Liz, please unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, I'm not sure if that was by mistake. Maybe it was. Yeah, the hand has gone down now. Okay. There's a question in the chat box, Isa, by Mimi Schmidt.
So should I look up the chat box, or would Padma?
No. Isabel will read out the question. Isabel.
Yeah. Someone asked, are you aware of the current status of restoration efforts of the Roxburgh House and collaborators between the UK and India?
I know a bit, yes, there is an attempt that's being restored. I haven't been there for a long time, but I don't know exactly what is going on in that building. But it's an amazing building. Particularly if you see from the river, looking back on the banks, it's a stunning building still to look at.
And actually that person has just raised her hand, Padma, I think.
No, I think she typed the question after. Okay, Advait wants to speak. Advait, I'm going to allow you to talk. Go ahead, Advait, if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, please.
Thanks so much, Pratik,
Advait.
for your talk. It's great to virtually meet you. I'm a vertebrate paleontologist at Yale, and I focus on the prehistory of South Asia. I guess my question is, with regards to paleontology and natural history in general, why do you think, from a historical perspective, has it not flourished as much in South Asia in post-colonial times as it may have in pre-colonial, in colonial times, when people like Falconer and Cotley got the Wollaston Medal and there were so many great discoveries made?
So are you asking me why paleontology did not flourish in India?
In post-colonial times. Why does paleontology or natural history in general, why does it not get the same importance? Are there any historical factors that may have prevented this?
I mean, it's an interesting question, but what happens, so it's a slightly different. So what happens with paleontology in the post, I have not really researched on the post-colonial period, so I'm struggling to answer that question in a bit. But what happens, I think, with paleontological research is, the Sahani, Birbal Sahani's museum Sahani's institute and the research they do. So, okay, to give you a longer picture is what happens with the colonial period of the paleontological research that takes place in India around the various kinds of the continental drift theories that developed in the 1930s in India and gradually get absorbed as the continental drift theory get developed. These are now absorbed within a much more global historical detail. So Sahani's work gets absorbed within a much wider global history of continental drift theory. So it becomes kind of, that old traditional picture of the wider picture, and the smaller stories become parts of that wider picture. The other story that is important here is, in many ways, in post-colonial India, and this is what I've written about in my book, which is called The Inscriptions of Nature, is many of the antiquarian aspects of paleontologic and fossil research from the 19th century gets absorbed within a very Indological tradition in India. And that then becomes part of search of various kinds of archaeological and antiquarian projects. So there's an entire post-colonial antiquarianism within which paleontology develops in this period. There are various other stories of various kinds of fossil research that takes place in the Himalayas, which I don't want to get into. That remains within India and is never circulated within the wider audience. I don't know why that happens, but I would imagine that is part of a problem of post-colonial science not being recognized within global science, or post-colonial science in India in generally struggling to get recognized. I don't know whether that answers your question. What is your assumption?
I mean, my take, based on most of the work that I've done on symbolic mammals and work after that, is that it sort of comes down to institutional support and sort of the forgotten history of Indian fossils in the Indian imagination. I think most people don't know that there are even fossils in India unless you live in Calcutta and you've been to the Indian Museum. So I think that sort of contributed to it. Plus, a lot of these fields like natural history and paleontology, they're fairly esoteric and require a lot of patronage. And I don't think that was sort of going on in post-colonial India. But there seem to be a lot of narratives about decolonizing science and about how there may be a colonial aspect to why these fields didn't take off. in the post-colonial world. So I was wondering if there were any reasons for that.
Yes, I mean there's another reason, of course, that post-colonial Indian science did not put as much emphasis and funding, of course, within to paleontology. Within the planning economy, it was much more focused towards economic geology. And so, although paleontology has close links with economic geology, but you are more asking about the deep time kind of paleontological history, which develops in the Wallick fossils. And
right.
So there is a failure. If you go to the Calcutta Museum, I don't know whether you've been to the National Museum recently, the fossils are literally piled up.
Mm-hmm.
There is no nomenclature, there is no names. So they are literally piled up. So there is a failure of paleontological vision in India, in an obvious sense, that paleontology as a science does not capture the Indian imagination of the past. So there is a failure, and those museums have kind of just become repositories of these fossils, the piles of repositories of fossils. And it is not just in Calcutta. It is the same you will see in Shimla, there's a Siwalik fossil museum near Shimla as well. The same kind of very postmodern kind of, there's actually a fossil of the tortoise, the Colossoceros atlas that is literally left in outside. So there is no imagination. In 19th century, in natural history museums, fossils, and with dinosaurs, it captured public imagination. Sorry, we are distracted, but that capturing of public imagination in India never took place through fossils. That would be my answer.
Okay, thank you.
I think I've borrowed your answer a bit.
Sorry. I see there's two questions in the question and answer. I see Joe Kane has one in the chat as well. So Liz Mercer asks, so should we reassess importance of common names? In the past, as a student, I was taught to ignore or discount them, as the botanical names were the proper ones that allowed us to communicate globally.
Yes, so the botanical names actually allow for a global communication, but they actually break down the communication as well. So, and that's what I have been trying to show. And so again, decolonization is not about going back to original. It's about uncovering the lost traces of history. So if those names help us, if those names connect us with those histories, it is fundamental that we revalue those names. And it's not very difficult to trace those names back, because there are textual evidences from the 18th century of those names to be tracked. So it's not a move for vernacular. And that's the point I wanted to make. It's not a move for vernacular. It is a move towards history. And the point maybe I'm making a too strong a point is, I think that natural historical tradition writes that history out. And it's the claiming of that history that is more important to me. So yes, that global language, as I said, has an incommensurability built within it.
So uncovering the layers.
Yes,
really.
yes. So the names but it's often not just the names, it's the objects themselves, the treatments, it's that tradition, yes.
Yeah, so the next question is related to that, I think. Sancha de Souza says, Pratik, thank you for a lovely talk. If I understand you correctly, you're saying that this is an issue of archives to some degree, historicizing objects, documents, art, etc., that could contribute to the understanding of global nature, but have been ignored by the history of science, which is focused on documentation done by Western natural history. Could you give us any examples of such materials that you may have encountered in your work in South Asia?
So, I'm a textual historian, so I've read texts. So if you read any 18th century texts, whether it's William Jones's own nomenclature, and there's a complex story of why he rejected linear nomenclature and adopted vernacular nomenclature. And we can, so if you read late 18th century materia medica texts in India, because they were written for surgeons, physicians in India, they would carry dual or triple names and uses. So there was this. So it is that. So any 18th century text that you read, you find this deep archive of history. And so it's not very difficult to find out. And there's a very interesting story of how the various cinchona substitutes that were found in India were rejected once quinine was discovered. But it is fairly simple to go back, and the textual archival sources are there to go back and find those kind of traditions. So it's basically a process of reading them in a slightly different way. See, the point that I'm making, also for me, finding it is not so difficult. It is, but the point that the epistemological problem that I'm posing here is natural history erases history. If we accept that, then it is possible. If we don't accept that, then it is useless. Those texts appear just vernacular texts with various traditions. So if you accept the premise of what I'm suggesting, that the history of nature is lost, sorry, Isabel might find that a very strong statement, but the history of nature is lost in natural history. If that is the premise that you accept, then reading or uncovering those become possible. Sorry. Yes.
I think
I've said it. Now I can't withdraw it.
I think I'm following, but so Joe Kane, and then there's another question in the Q&A, says, with European botany based essentially on extraction, what does its classification and systematics miss or omit? For instance, maybe plants they think are useless, or maybe parts of the story of plants that don't contribute to cultivation and extraction. Perhaps you can give another example of something Europeans completely miss or omit.
Oh, so I don't want to go, because there's a whole book I've written about, roots, Columba roots, various kinds of medical botany in Jamaica, Suetenia febrifuga. But see, is that from Joe?
Yes.
Hi, Joe. See, look, I would actually start at the very beginning of your question, is what is about European botany. Now, the point I'm making, and the point I've made before, is it's not European, non-European divide that I'm trying to stress. Europe does not want you is a phrase that is coming out of an European missionary to an European botanist. So it's a rejection of Europeans oneself from the other. And so that the tension is located in that. The tension is not located within European botany and non-European botany. That would be a simpler problem to solve. The point I'm making is, for giving an example that I would give, is when the Pietist missionaries collected plants in southern India, connected to various medical traditions, and they collected texts, Tamil texts, and they translated the texts, and their library was a rich library of these various medical botanical texts of indigenous texts and the garden, and they sent them to Halle. The superiors in Halle rejected this, said that these missionaries were sent to Europe to spread Christianity to the heathens, not to send heathen nonsense back to Europe. So you see the problem of that. So there is that problem of that textured knowledge, of the deeper textured knowledge of nature being rejected, is a more complex one. And what the missionaries experienced in the 18th century, what Sirampur William Carey experienced, is that complex history that I've tried to present. So I wouldn't want to go back to European and non-European history.
I'm gonna, sorry, I'll get to the question in the Q&A. Just a question for me. Do you think that's specific to medicinal plants in particular, or to the whole of botany, say?
It is easier to trace that in medicinal botany because it's more cultural. So medical plants are more cultural, and by that respect more historic, because it's easier to trace those medical cultures. But I find that the history of Jamaica in the 17th century, where there's a mercantilism, that almost every rock appears a promise of a bullion, and I've studied that how the vision of Jamaica changed. So this is not medical botany itself, but how the texture understanding of nature changed from mercantilism to plantation of an island is equally interesting if you study those complex histories. And there are other kind of non-medical elements to it, which is about how the Orientalists studied Indian nature as remains of what is known as biblical sacred nature. And that's a completely different tradition, but they were basically people like William Jones in the 18th century or late 18th century were searching for traces of the deluge in Indian traditions. And they studied Indian texts, the Puranas, and the fossils as remains of a different world, of a culture. So there is that complex history of nature that develops outside medical botany that also remains within those traditions. And again, there's no European, non-European divide in that.
Yes, and your example of Roxburgh that you used in your talk actually made me think of a collection we have at the Linnean Society. And I know there's a couple of people in the audience who will know more than I do about it. It's Francis Buchanan Hamilton, whose work he gave to James Edward Smith and was by and large mostly ignored as well, and not particularly published. So, okay, I better get to the question in the Q&A. Kate Teltscher says, many thanks for your paper. Looking at that wonderful image of the Avenue of Palms in Calcutta Botanical Gardens got me thinking about the imperial expression of power through botanical gardens. There are palm avenues in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, Peridania in Sri Lanka, Belarat in Victoria.
In Taiwan, in Taiwan, there is a botanical garden, there is a palm avenue. So there's that power, yes, that power of the corridor.
Yes, in Georgetown, Guyana. Have you considered the spatial horticultural aspect of imperial botany at all?
I have not, but there are a lot of work that is going on, developing from colonial colonial botanical gardens. It's not something I have worked, but the power of that plants, the spatial distinction is fascinating. And see, your question has completely now made me look at these space. So I tend to think plantations as the power, the plantation as a statement, but if you literally see those gardens, if you see those impressive structures of plant that they built, that is a fascinating topic to study. I didn't think about it that way. I mean, you see these patterns repeating themselves. And so these patterns of power, these patterns of visual strength repeating themselves, and you wonder why and what does it signify.
Gina says, thank you very much. So it just remains me to thank you on behalf of the Linnean Society for such a wonderful and stimulating talk. And for everyone, our lectures are recorded and can be found on YouTube later on if you've missed parts of it. So thank you very much, Pratik, for coming to give your lecture this evening. And goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Padma. Thanks, everyone, for attending.
Bye.